All right, so our topic tonight is economic power. So we'll start with an easy question. What is economics? I'm just kidding. It's not actually an easy question. But here's something you can take with you for the rest of your life. And that is the definition of what economics is. So it is the science of the allocation of scarce resources. Most resources are finite. And of those finite resources, many of them are scarce. And as a result, they must be allocated in some way. Now, economics can scale from very small to very large. You know, we talk about global economics, for instance, as well as home economics, which would probably be the smallest version of that. But it all comes down basically to this issue. How are resources going to be allocated when there's a scarcity of them? Second thing to note is that economics is a social science. What does that mean? Anyone? What is a social science? Yes?
It's like the study of people's behaviors.
Yes, exactly. Right. So social sciences study people, and by definition, therefore, economics studies people. Now, Michael Mann says economic power derives from the human need to extract, transform, distribute, and consume the products of nature. Economic relations are powerful because they combine the intense mobilization of labor with very extensive circuits of capital, trade, and production chains, providing a combination of intensive and extensive power, and normally also of authoritative and diffused power. Now, that is an awful lot of terminology. Here are the main things to bear in mind about economic power. First of all, like other forms of power, it's reciprocal, right? There's more than one direction in which the power relationships run. Even something like military power, because very rarely, probably almost never, is military power going to be exercised by a single person. The human resources on one side and the human resources on the other side of a conflict will constitute that reciprocal relationship. Or in political power, particularly in a democracy, where the people who vote constitute one side of the relationship of political power, whereas the office holder who's then elected holds the other position. In economic power, it's a little bit more complicated. We'll talk about Marx in a couple of weeks, and Marx will basically define the relationship of economic power as one between workers and management in the sort of the roughest possible terms for now. And by and large, that still really applies when we talk about economic power. We're talking about people who are doing employing on the one hand and people who are being employed on the other, because almost never can a good or a service be just traded or sold without any work needing to be done on it. Arguably never. And once you talk about work needing to be done, particularly work that requires any amount of cooperation, then you are talking about labor power, the need for people to do work so that some end product exists. The other relationship that exists in an economic power relationship is between a person who wants to sell something and a person who wants to buy something. All of those relationships are still reciprocal, but they are slightly different in what they imply. So from an historical perspective, economics is a pretty new thing, because when you're hunter-gathering, you don't have an economic structure to speak of because all of your resources are scarce, but your number of people are limited, right? A couple dozen usually is the most. And so, but it's because survival is basically a daily struggle, and your continued survival depends on everybody within that group surviving, because everybody participates to some extent. except for babies, obviously, but then because you're going to require them down the road, you have to obviously care for them. And remember that these hunter-gatherer societies are characterized by this thing, fierce egalitarianism, right? There's generally speaking a broad system of equality. So economics doesn't really come into the picture. But with permanent settlements, again, through agriculture, surplus of food means the ability to settle in a place, live longer, population grows, division of labor emerges, and more complex economic relationships, well, first simple and then complex economic relationships begin to develop. Debt is the underlying relationship of these initial relationships. And it's not a real complex thing, right? I mean, you're not going to have all the resources that you need at any particular time, so you might borrow somebody else's, and that creates a situation of debt, and then you pay that person back, and that debt is taken care of. But it does require something called credit, which means that, and again, this, 5,000 years ago, this is taking place in a very informal way. Some record keeping of who owes what to whom, as well as the terms in which those debts are going to be repaid, and probably most important of all, to the power relationship, the trustworthiness of the person that is doing the borrowing to pay it back, and reciprocally the character of the person doing the lending, that the terms of repayment are not going to be overly onerous. The vast majority of economic transactions in the ancient world take place on this level, with no money changing hands, and barter actually being something that, although maybe you learned in high school or even earlier, was sort of constituted the main way that ancient societies conducted trade. It actually, because almost never are you going to be able to trade, some parcel of goods on one hand for a parcel of goods on the other, and there not be some discrepancy in what the things are worth. Barter's not going to really be a good way of dealing with the kinds of trades that need to take place on a regular basis. So you'll barter in situations that are more rare, which means that, more distant relationships, not your cousins or your, second or third cousins, but maybe, the people that are in your clan, your enlarged family structure, but you're still sort of distantly related. You might barter with those people because you can at least sort of sell yourself on the idea that if you didn't get a great deal on the trade now, you'll probably trade with these people at some point in the future, and you'll get your money back at the, not in the literal sense, right? You'll get the value of your trade back at a later date. Money, though, currency, really doesn't begin to enter the picture until you have things like trade between cities, and then in a bigger sense, trade between countries. Because then there's no trust relationship that exists at all in most cases. Everybody's looking out for their own, and so you make an agreement, you make essentially a social contract. And again, it's not a social contract that is entered into consciously or at a particular moment in time, but rather you agree because you come from the same part of the world where this thing is scarce, that gold will be a good way of determining the value of something. And then you'll coin gold and you'll trade in that for people that you don't know particularly well. Before we move on, any questions about this? So if we live in a society now that operates pretty much entirely on a currency system, with things like barter being fairly non-existent, at least as a regular way of doing things. We have credit, of course, because we have debt. In fact, it could be argued debt is one of the primary driving forces of civilization in the first place. But currency is sort of the overwhelming majority of transactions that goes on today. In the ancient world, this was not the case. Currency was a rare thing, not a common thing. It's one of the reasons why they don't find, when they do archaeological digs, what they're not finding are, just big piles of coins laying everywhere. There's actually more than one reason for that. But I mean, first of all, they were not that common. Second of all, they were valuable, and if you wanted to melt them down and make them into something else, there was usually no law against that, so you did that too. But it's not like if you, say, went into a person's house at random, you could find, quarters, dimes strewn about in places, underneath couch cushions, that kind of thing. You don't see that in the ancient world. Questions? So, ancient Egypt provides an example of one kind of economic system. Like all societies back then, it is an agrarian economy. It is a farming-based economy. And under the pharaohs, and the pharaohs rule Egypt for literally thousands of years, until about 2,000 years ago, Egypt is ruled by pharaohs. And to give you some idea of just how old Egyptian society is, it has been, it was longer between the pyramids being built and Cleopatra dying than it is between Cleopatra dying and the day. And that's 2,000 years. So for millennia, Egypt operated as a what's called a redistributive economy. And we say that's a command economy because rather than there being a situation in which people have the ability to buy and sell as they please, their primary product as people that farm, their crop, is going to be requisitioned by the state and redistributed to the people based on their need. This is important for a lot of reasons. First of all, it sets an early example for command economies that we see later on. And second of all, because it requires the emergence of what's called a bureaucratic elite. We talked about elites last week, right? These are the small percentage of people within any society who play important roles in things like religion and culture and politics. Economic elites exist everywhere. Usually, in this country, the economic elites are sort of subdivided, but the topmost elites are the Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates and people like that who are billionaires. There's a broader economic elite of people that are millionaires who are far more numerous. Nevertheless, that's a very small percentage of the country's population. So that's an elite. A bureaucratic elite is just a sort of a class of people within a society whose job it is to make the machinery of government work. So when you have a redistributive economy, it requires that the people who are growing the food and harvesting the food then send the food to the center of government, and then that it be counted there and divided there and then sent back out again. And all of that requires human resources. And the people who are managing that process are this bureaucratic elite. And currency is used here, but it is not used, it's not considered to have inherent value. So when we talk about currency, money, we say that it serves three purposes. It's a medium of exchange, a unit of account, and a store of value. So a medium of exchange means that we live together in a society and an economy, so we agree that I can give you dollars our particular currency for a good or service. That's a medium of exchange. A unit of account is just a way of keeping track of transactions on the books. And a store of value is the idea that your currency, whatever it is, has actual inherent value. Which it's sort of easy to see something like gold having inherent value. It's a little bit more difficult to see something like paper money that is backed by the full faith and credit of the United States government as having inherent value. But it becomes more concrete when I ask you to give me $500, right? Then the sort of the inherent value of it seems a lot more real. They don't have that last aspect of currency in ancient Egypt. They use it mainly for accounting purposes and maybe to offset shortfalls or overages in certain surpluses. So this is an important quote to understand the power relationships that exist within a redistributive economy. So I'll read and then unpack. Such a system depends heavily on a strong central government, on the one hand, and a firm trust in that government's ability to deliver goods and services back to producers on the other. Redistribution demands personal relationships that are reinforced by mutual responsibility and trust. Peasants and craftsmen, and peasant, by the way, is a person who is a farmer that either doesn't own land or owns a small amount of land. Peasants and craftsmen offer up their production to the central authority and depend in turn on that center for support. If that trust is violated, the entire system collapses. Such a system is obviously embedded in the culture as a whole. It depends for its success on a firmly believed political ideology and a social structure that is widely accepted. It is enforced by ritual, perhaps to the point where ritual considerations outweigh economic consequences. So to understand this in sort of plainer terms, basically what they're saying is, well, this kind of society with this kind of economy is going to have to rely on a huge amount of trust. Because if it doesn't, then why would the farmers ever give up their crop? After all, if they give up their crop and they don't get anything back from the government, they're going to starve. And their most basic need won't be met, and that it'll fail. The other part of that relationship, though, is often forgotten but needs to be borne in mind. The government doesn't want a situation in which the farmers fail to deliver up the food, because if it can't carry out its own particular mandate to redistribute this food, then it's not going to have any confidence from the people. Revolution or something like that could happen, and therefore it's in everybody's best interest that it be done on the basis of trust and that it be done well. We talk here about political ideology and social structure that is widely accepted. Anybody know anything about the political structure or religious beliefs of ancient Egypt? I don't expect that you do, just maybe somebody does. Right, you've got your pharaoh, who is your monarch, and he is literally a personified god. And so if it's his command that you hand over your food, then you're going to hand your food over. And whether he actually is or believes that he is a personified god is irrelevant. What's important is that you believe it, and therefore you follow that particular rule. But again, it also puts the pharaoh in the position of having to then deliver on being a god. It also requires something not mentioned here, which is worth just considering for a moment, which is the geography of it. So here's Egypt, and here's the Nile River Valley, right? And it's a very thin strip around the Nile River Valley that's fertile, where you can actually farm, and the rest of Egypt is a desert. So you're not actually talking about huge distances that need to be traveled to get those goods into the center and back out again. So a system like that can work from a logistical standpoint as well. But the trust and the competence, the doing the job well, all of those things, they matter a lot. So what you don't have in ancient Egypt is a situation where the economy is characterized by a lot of people independently selling goods and services and negotiating over prices and things like that. They might do that for personal items. There's probably a small class of people that, that are engaged in trades in their cities, as there are in most agricultural societies. But the vast majority of people do farming. The vast majority of their needs are going to be met by themselves, and therefore the system, doesn't really at this point require a system where people are buying, selling, negotiating, entering into markets and things like that. Slavery and taxes also exist. Slavery is literally as old as human beings. So slaves are usually prisoners of war. Egypt actually wages war very little because it has no advantage to there's no advantage to it gaining territory, particularly with the way that it does things. They use a system called corvée labor, which is a kind of indentured servitude where you are you're forced to work without pay for a particular period of time in order to pay off debt. And tax is in the form of a tithe, which is, the word literally comes from an old English word for the fraction of a tenth, which is the percentage you would give to the church in medieval England. But a tithe still is something that exists in churches today. It's the basic agreement that you are going to give over some percentage of your money to contribute to the functioning of a religious organization, the feeding and clothing and pay, for that matter, of the people that work for it, so on and so forth. Again, in a system that's characterized by a sort of a unified Godhead monarch, getting that kind of thing is going to be relatively easy to get. So the other useful example from the ancient world is the Roman Empire. Now, the economy, like Egypt's, was still overwhelmingly agrarian. The vast majority of people still engaged in farming. But unlike Egypt, Rome was an empire, as the name Roman Empire probably clued you into. So what is it? Let's talk about this for a minute, because it's an important term to define and understand. What is an empire? Yes?
Isn't it one country or society that has rule over others?
Yes. And almost always that one society that has control over others, that the underlying motivation for doing so is economic. It might be justified through something like racism. It might be enforced through political or through military power. But the only reason that could possibly make the headache of running an empire worthwhile would be the economic benefit from it. Yeah?
Don't businesses have empires today?
They do. They do. So it's meant in a slightly different sense because the sort of the unique political aspects of empires are lacking there. And basically, in that sense, it sort of means like the territories that are that have been accumulated to that particular company to do business in. So that, for instance, something like Standard Oil, which was the Rockefeller Oil Company 100 years ago, starts in one place and and might control the oil business in that town. but ultimately, as Rockefeller did, controls the oil industry in the entire country. It can be said to be an empire at that point, sort of meant in that sense. So a distinguishing feature, by the way, of an empire is that the people that run it are usually the minority among the population. And that brings its own unique challenges, because one thing that history has shown us is that people don't like being ruled by foreigners. But that's inherent to the idea of what empire is. Right, so I mean, understand, just to again give it a sense visually, this is the Roman Empire, and the capital of Rome here, but there's quite a bit of ethnic diversity within that area, and numerous different languages spoken. The predominant language spoken in the Roman Empire, in fact, is never Latin, but is Greek. And so empire, for that reason, brings challenges. Now, the big difference with ancient Rome economically is that it's a market economy, and therefore it is subject to the laws of supply and demand. More on that in a moment. And the reason for this really is because although again, everybody still mainly is involved in farming, because it's a large enough area of land that's being covered, there's going to be enough diversity of things being grown in different times of the year that markets for specific agricultural goods will emerge in some places and not others. One of the benefits of empire is that it allows for goods from places that are far apart to be, traverse those areas much more cheaply than they would otherwise. Which means that if I'm a citizen of the Roman Empire in southern Britain, I can eat an orange, right? Which they don't grow in southern England, just to be clear about that. They grow them, at that point, they grow them historically in Palestine, in what's Israel and the Palestinian territories today. But because they're both part of the Roman Empire, if I want to eat an orange, I can actually lay my hands on one. It might be pretty expensive, but I can get one. And by the way, once I get one, and I like it, or enough people get them and like them, then a market for that is going to emerge, and things like supply and demand are going to come into effect. Again, more on that in a moment. Rome is also a slave economy. It relies extensively on slavery. In fact, it is pretty much the case through maybe not a majority, but a big proportion of Rome's history that property owning people don't work, period. And slaves actually outnumber the number of free people within the borders of the Roman Empire, such that it has this kind of, and the last part about it is, while slavery is never awesome, slavery in the ancient world, in fact, for most of history, was just very qualitatively different than slavery was in the United States and in the transatlantic slave trade for 500 years. For one thing, it wasn't multi-generational. Second thing, it wasn't specifically racialized. And third, slaves weren't a commodity. And so there weren't economic incentives that were attached to it and everything that entails. And in Rome, if you were a slave to a particularly wealthy family, that could be a pretty decent life. So those things being the case, and because who doesn't want to not work for a living, there's an incentive then to amass slaves. And because the primary sources of slaves in the ancient world are POWs and debtors, Well, Rome's constantly fighting people, so that's going to be useful to supplying slaves. And then market economies are going to be pretty good at creating debt as well. Rome really conducts, in terms of the ancient world, pretty much the most extensive trade that is being handled by a single government. And it's why it is instructive to look at. So let's say we talk about supply and demand. So this is what is called a supply curve. It's not curved, it's just a straight line. I understand that. See where it says S1? Right? That's the supply of beer in this particular graph. If the supply of beer goes down, we shift that curve to the left, that line to the left, so that it moves, so indicating that there's less of a supply of beer. So here's what it is important to note about this. First of all, your y-axis, your vertical, is price, and your x-axis, your horizontal, is quantity, right? So change the quantity, move the quantity down, you move your curve closer to 0. So when you decrease the supply of a good or a service, what happens to the price of it? It goes up. That's supply, basically, right? And if and conversely, if the supply of something goes way up, the price goes down because it's easier to meet demand. Here's demand. Same good or service here, a good beer being offered. Demand 1, the solid green line. When demand goes up, it shifts to D2. Price and quantity are still on the y and x axes, respectively. If demand for a good or service goes up, what happens to the price? Absent any change in supply, just think about demand right now. If people want something more than they want it less, and the actual supply on hand remains the same, what happens to the price? People want it more. Am I going to charge less for it or more for it? I'm going to charge more for it, and I'm going to be able to justify doing so because people want it more, and therefore they'll pay more. Same thing goes with demand going down, right? If demand goes down, then I want to get something that people don't want off my hands, then I'll sell it for a lot less, and the price goes down. So supply and demand are the main forces in understanding economic relationships, and economic relationships then constituting what economic power is. So here's the sort of the most important thing of all. The point at which supply and demand meet is called equilibrium. And what it means, roughly speaking, is that here is the price, the equilibrium price for a good or a service, which is the least I'm willing to sell it for and the most you're willing to pay for it. And I'll keep whatever supply on hand to continue to get that price so that you'll continue to pay. Now, there are a couple of really important stipulations about equilibrium. The first thing is that here's something about economics that you don't often hear, which is that the ability of the supply and demand for a good or service to reach equilibrium in a truly freely trading market is pretty much perfect. This actually really works. Now, there's a caveat to that, and that is to remember that economics is a social science, right? So suppose that I'm a factory owner, right? And I have some good I have some good that I'm selling. I'm selling umbrellas, right? So I run an umbrella factory, and I sell umbrellas, and I sell them for $5 a unit. And that's the situation at the beginning of our story, right? And then all of a sudden what happens is, for reasons that are incredibly unimportant, because if I began to explain that I would never be able to finish the story A and B, probably it's not even possible, and so you're just going to have to go with me on it. The sun moves slightly closer to the earth, and rain no longer happens on planet Earth. And now, let's say it happens much more rarely. And now the demand for umbrellas has gone way down. That means, according to the laws of supply and demand, that the price is going to go down, right? The question to answer, and this is bearing in mind that economics is a social science, well, how does the price go down? How can I continue to run my factory if I'm charging less for my product? What am I going to have to do to make sure that that happens and that I don't go under? Yeah.
Cut costs.
I'm going to cut costs. How am I going to do that?
Cheaper materials.
Cheaper materials. What's another way I can do it? Yes.
Less labor.
I'm sorry?
Less labor.
That's the big one, right? From a power standpoint, that's the big one. Maybe not less labor. Maybe I just won't I maybe just get rid of the safety inspector, or maybe cut corners because it'll be cheaper to do that. And that's where the power relationship enters here, right? Because, and by the way, let's look at it from the other side of the coin as well. Well, I mean, if I'm in a society where my rights for collective bargaining are protected, and I'm a member of a union, you're gonna have to, and for that matter, I'm in a state where they have to fire me for cause, then just firing me is, maybe not going to be the best thing for you, because maybe then my entire union will strike, or will do something that will make the possible economic damage of you doing this even worse for you. So we say that this operates perfectly in determining its equilibrium, and it does, but it's a messy process, right? I mean, so yeah, it's true that it will always find that point, but it doesn't care about consequences beyond finding that equilibrium, because it doesn't have a brain, right? I mean, it's just a system. The people that are involved in it have a brain, but they also have their individual motives and fears and concerns and families that they have to feed and so on and so forth, right? And that being the case, the way that meets equilibrium is going to be either, on the one hand, done without concern for things like health, wealth, health, safety, income of workers, quality of product. In this particular set of circumstances, by the way, I'm not talking about across the board. If there's regulation in place, it's going to be much more difficult for that equilibrium to be met from the standpoint of the guy who makes umbrellas. The minute that you begin to put constraints on that relationship, it operates less effectively. So that's also 100% true. In the same way that it's 100% true that system will work 100% of the time if it's allowed to, it's also 100% true that the minute that you begin to regulate it in any way, it operates less effectively. And so, to a very large extent, market economies are trade-offs between what benefit you get out of it versus what sacrifice you're willing to make. Where power comes into that is the extent to which you have the ability to, for instance, defer a particular need. The extent to which you can survive for a week, a month, a year without a consistent income. And that doesn't just go for the workers, right? I mean, if you're a person running a business, any idea where that's coming from? Is that coming from in there? Do they have a class in there?
know if it's James's fault. It sounded like it was coming from right there. I was like, what? That's where I thought it was coming from.
Why are you depressed?
There's just two people in there. How about some nice headphones? So, where was I? Economics. Yeah, so it works, but it has consequences, and the way that it works is going to benefit some and not benefit others. Or it's going to benefit some people now and some people later. Or it's going to benefit some people a lot and some people a little. And that's sort of the nature of the beast. So, questions before we move on to this? So there is a cycle that drives ancient societies in particular, although it really kind of particularly gains a lot of speed about 500 years ago. So we're talking about the Roman Empire a moment ago. Empires require war because almost nobody is going to let you march into their country without a fight and begin to use their precious economic resources. Soldiers prefer to be paid in cash. Why would soldiers prefer to be paid in cash? Why is that important to soldiers? Yes?
So that they can distribute it amongst their families?
Yeah, I mean, and in particular, I mean, if they're being paid, before they go and march out, bearing in mind that it's not a typical thing that a war will go on for years and years and years. They can be. It can be. It's certain that they can leave it to their families and that it'll have some value, right? There's not going to be a matter of it not being able to trade whatever thing they bartered for in order to go march into a war. I mean, what other reasons would soldiers demand to be paid in cash? To be paid, particularly, let's put it in real terms again, to be paid in gold or silver in this particular time historically, rather than saying, think about the other way that people are paid in the ancient world, right? They have credit extended to them. They're gonna want to be paid in cash because it has inherent value, and they can't guarantee they're going to come back from what they're doing alive. So they can't defer their gratification with what they're being paid, right? They don't have the luxury of time. It's also true that they're going to be fighting in a foreign country. And so if they want to buy something while they're in that foreign country, they're going to need currency to do it. Something with inherent value that's valuable not only to them, but to whoever they want to buy a good or service from. Although it also bears mention that one of the reasons why they never really have a shortage in finding people to go fight in wars is because there's also the promise that if you win, you can basically take whatever you want from the country you've beaten. So here's how this begins to be driven, particularly about 500 years ago. Soldiers prefer to be paid in cash. The best soldiers are actually, at this point historically, are mercenaries, paid soldiers that are just paid. And there's almost never a draft. And there's no such thing as a standing army for that matter. Standing armies don't exist until about 400 years ago. In the ancient world, they're non-existent. And they're basically private on top of it. Like if the pharaoh or the emperor or whatever wants to go to war, he raises an army. And he raises an army by offering money. And the best money he can offer is going to be coined silver or gold, so that's what he's going to do. Now, by its very nature, because it has inherent value, or I should say the relationship goes the other way, it has inherent value on the basis of it being scarce. Gold and silver are in short supply, and they have to be mined. So one of the reasons why territory is acquired is because there's an awareness, or at least a hope, that, that silver or gold is going to be found there. And then you can take the POWs that you get from having won that war, and you can put them to work in the mines. And then they'll mint coins. Those coins get sent, or actually they'll reap the raw metal. You'll coin it back in your country. And then you have a cycle for you to, you have currency, more currency for you to then pay your soldiers with for the next time you need to do this. And, you know, when your stores get low, you keep going. You rinse and repeat. So, for instance, you know, the Spaniards, they go into the Western Hemisphere in 1492, famously. And, you know, in particular with Pizarro in what's now Peru, the boats that came back were routinely filled with pretty much nothing but silver and gold. So that the Spaniards became as wealthy as they did by virtue of mining all of this silver and gold. And once they discovered it was there, then it just made more sense for them to dump more resources into getting more. But of course, that requires soldiers to conquer more territory who want to be paid in silver and gold. So it creates this kind of vicious cycle. So it's a big driver for a lot of the things that we see in capitalism as it emerges with the Industrial Revolution. It's not an accident in the Industrial Revolution in the age of the greatest colonial expansion are, you know, sort of happen side by side. Another important thing to understand is banking. So the creation of large surplus wealth creates a need for deposit banks. Because after all, people are going to want to steal your stuff. And so you're going to want to put it in a safe place. Which means that banks will be a thing, right? Now, who's going to be a banker, by the way? Well, it's going to be somebody that can provide the security, obviously. That's going to require some pre-existing economic power on their part to be able to pay the people that will provide that security in the form of military power. And we talked about very briefly in talking about Machiavelli, the Medici family, they gained their political power through the economic power of banking. They had already been wealthy, but in getting into banking, they really became sort of supremely wealthy. Now, it's also true that some people in these societies will make more money than they can ever possibly use. Or at the very least, they will make enough money that they can leave some of it in the bank and not worry about having to take it out immediately. They can say, I can keep it here for 5 years, 10 years, so on and so forth. So that incentivizes the banks themselves to then take the money that's being lent, that's being stored in those banks, deposited in those banks, and lend it out to other people. You know, on the understanding that it gets paid back, and moreover that it gets paid back with interest. Now, you know, obviously that's going to be a problem for some of the depositors. So the pay for that is that some of that interest goes back to the depositors. So they get paid for depositing their money and allowing it to be used in this way. And that ultimately, you know, becomes an incentive to deposit. Once it's clear that sufficient security exists, that there's sufficient enforcement of the repayment of loans, that this interest to depositors can actually be paid, then there's no reason for a person that has excess wealth to not deposit it in banks. And then it becomes, again, sort of a self-fulfilling and self-perpetuating form of industry. But it also lends itself to usury. So usury is, well, anybody? Usury? Usury is the charging of unfair levels of interest. And if you say, well, what's unfair? The answer is, right, what's unfair? The average credit card contract charges 20% per year, which is a lot, by the way. So, you know, but your average loan shark will charge you, you know, 10% on what you borrowed from him per week. And if you don't make that weekly payment, he'll tack it onto the principal, and then that'll keep going. Now, the situation of a loan shark is clearly usury, because it's a situation in which it becomes so burdensome to the borrower that you know, it either just completely busts the person out, or they, you know, flee or do something like that. The consequences are clear enough in a situation like that that you know that it's negative and unfair and all these other things. Now, on one hand, the argument could be made, and in fact it will be made, by particularly the Christian and Muslim communities of Europe and the Near East, that it's sinful to lend money on interest at all. Because the minute that you burden somebody with the need to pay back more than what they borrowed, it raises a moral question. That you're forcing a person to pay you back more than basically what you've extended to them means that you are burdening them more than you burdened yourself. As well as the sort of the recognition in the early or in the ancient world that this was how things like slavery came into existence, and you know, that it gave rise to all kinds of negative consequences, like, you know, increased crime rates and so on and so forth. They just completely outlawed the charging of money on interest at all. The problem with that is that then there's no incentive for people to deposit in banks. So like any other good or service or market, there's going to be an equilibrium point that's reached with regard to interest. And if there is no regulation, then it will do so more efficiently than if there is. It's also going to matter to some extent in Christian and Muslim countries how strictly they're going to enforce those rules. After the Protestant Reformation in Europe, they're not going to be pretty much enforced at all. And in the Muslim countries, they're going to be enforced at some times and not others. So these are going to be the basic conditions of banking basically until 40 years ago. At 40 years ago, the conditions in banking changed radically. We'll maybe talk about that next time. So, I want to talk about feudalism. But before we do, I want to show you this video. I'll figure this out in a minute, I swear.
For a guy who moved all day long.
Is that loud enough for you?
For a guy who moved all day long, Paulie didn't talk to 6 people. If there was a union problem or, say, a beef in the numbers, then only the top guys could meet with Paulie to discuss the problem. Everything was one-on-one. Paulie hated conferences. He didn't want anybody hearing what he said, and he didn't want anybody listening to what he was being told. Hundreds of guys depended on Paulie, and he got a piece of everything they made. It was tribute, just like in the old country, except they were doing it here in America. And all they got from Paulie was protection from other guys looking to rip them off. And that's what it's all about. That's what the FBI could never understand. That what Paulie and the organization does is offer protection for people who can't go to the cops. That's it. That's all it is. They're like the police department for wise guys.
So why do I show you that? Well, first of all, understand what he's talking about, right? He's basically saying the mafia is an economic organization that operates on the basis of the idea that the business that you could do at the lowest levels requires you to kick a percentage of that up the ladder. And then the work that's done at the level above that, they kick up as well at a higher percentage, but at the same time they make more money. And at the highest levels of all is the guy that collects that money, and he holds the most power. But his responsibility in return is that he protects you. That if there's a problem that you have, that he's going to solve it. And again, like every other economic relationship, it's reciprocal, right? You do one thing, they do another. There's some kind of mutual exchange that goes on. And feudalism is based basically on the same idea. And it's not an accident that the Italians and Sicilians that came to the United States and ultimately founded the mafia here came from what was essentially a feudal society, still a feudal society. So it is a political system based on reciprocal relationships and patronage. Patronage is like favor banking. Right? I do this for you, and I'll do a favor for you later on. And sort of circles of people that are have mutual responsibilities and debts to one another take care of each other. And the relationships that exist are between the lords, who are the landholders, and the knights, who provide the military power, the physical protection. There are the lords, the landowners, and the vassals, the people that actually live on the land, who do things like manage the estate. The lords hold a reciprocal relationship with the peasants, who are the actual farmers. They do something called tenant farming, which basically means that in exchange for a place to live and some share of the food that they grow for themselves to eat, they farm, and they give over what they farm to the vassals. And then finally, there's the relationship between the lords and the serfs. And the serfs are like the peasants, except that they don't have any freedom. They're what's called tied to the land. So whereas a peasant can, if he or she so chooses, get up and go to the city and ply a trade, a serf can't do that. But these are the relationships. And so it's a hierarchy. And at the very top is the lord. And then the lord has beneath him sort of two groups. On the one hand, the knights who do the enforcement, and then the vassals who do the bureaucratic management, and then everybody else falls in under the vassals, based on how much of their crop they control for themselves, how free they are to give up that particular position. The people on the bottom are the serfs, and they don't have it good, understand, but the justifying this whole system is the idea that that they are protected in some way that they otherwise would not be. That if injustice arises, that they can go to their vassal, who can then appeal to their lord for a political decision made in their favor. That if there is an attack from another country, that the knights who are assigned to protect their particular community are going to actually protect them. It's a protection scheme in very much the same way. Money flows up, and the wealthiest people are on top. The least empowered and poorest people are at the bottom. But they're getting this protection in return. Now, just to be clear, they're not getting that much protection. If they were, you wouldn't have to tie them to the land, right? You could leave them free, and they could choose to be there or not be there. So, you know, it only sort of kind of works in the same way that, you know, the mafia boss is supposed to protect you, but if you're, you know, eating at the restaurant and somebody comes in and shoots you, he hasn't done that good of a job at it, right? Same thing here. So feudalism is the predominant economic mode of organization in Europe. And it will remain that way into the early modern period, really. But a few things will cause it to shift relatively radically. And the first one is this guy right here, Yersinia pestis. Anybody know what that is? That is a bacterium. Anybody know what disease it causes? And the historical import. Anyone? So Yersinia pestis causes the Black Death, the bubonic plague. So in the middle of the 14th century, and nobody really knows for certain who brings it in or how. I mean, we know how, it's rats. And we know why, trade. And we know where from, someplace in Asia, trade routes coming into, through Asia Minor into Europe. But it kills a third of the population in like 2 years. Now that's obviously catastrophic by anybody's measure. So it gives rise to all kinds of consequences beyond just the sheer problem of, you know, an enormous amount of human death. So there's, you know, huge political upheavals and, you know, apocalyptic religious cults and all kinds of things happening in Europe as a response to this. Because remember, they don't have the germ theory of disease, so they don't know what causes it. So it's like magic spells or the Jews or whatever, right? I mean, but what they're not going to do is have a particularly good understanding of what's happening to them or how to protect themselves from it. So all kinds of negative consequences will arise from that as well. It's also going to have really huge economic consequences too, though. Because, well, look at it this way. If you are in the middle of an epidemic, would you rather be in the country or in the city? Why?
City has a lot of people.
City has a lot of people. Why is that a problem in an epidemic?
Why it's really fast.
It'll spread more quickly, right? There's just greater chance of contagion. Now, you might think, well, isn't that contingent on understanding the germ theory of disease? The answer to that is, well, no, because you can at least observe that if you come near a person with the Black Death and a week later you're dead, then the simple rule of cause and effect will come into play, and you'll want to be as isolated as possible, right? So, I mean, they'll understand quarantine and things like that, even if they don't understand the specific mode of transmission. You're going to want to be in the country. So, follow me to the next step. Does the Black Death hit hardest in the country or in the city?
City.
The cities are hit much more hard. Who works in the city, right? I mean, we have societies that are overwhelming, and to give you an idea of overwhelming, it's like more than 90% of people in Europe in the 14th century are involved in agriculture. They own a farm, or they work a farm, or some combination of those two. And they're going to be hit really badly by this, but what's going to be hit much, much worse are going to be the cities because of the reasons that we just handled. But you don't farm in the city, right? The people that live in the city are tradespeople. So, you know, the people that make the sickle that you need to cut, you know, to thresh your wheat with, that guy's going to be in the city. Your blacksmith, for that matter, who shoes your horses, he's going to be in the city. And now all the people that did those jobs are dead. Supply and demand, right? So, and just like anything else, human beings are a resource. People to do labor are a resource. If you cut the supply, what's going to happen to the price? Which here is going to be the wage that is going to be paid to do this job. It'll go up. It'll go way up. Because the need for people to do those things is going to still be there. And by the way, who's going to come in and fill the discrepancy that might exist between the ability of farmers to pay for these goods and services and the price that can be called in a market for that good or service? Who's going to make up that difference? Yeah. Banks will make it up in the form of loans. Governments, generally speaking. But here's the sort of the big thing, is that there's going to be a huge rush of people to go live in cities as a result of this. Far more than ever before. You're still going to have 90% of the people working on farms, or close to it, but you're going to have the emergence of a sort of a whole new class of people, because the fact that you can make, quote unquote, real money now, applying a trade in the city, means that it'll be more attractive to people than it was before. And as a result of it being more attractive, more people will go to the city. And that will create in and of itself the need for more people to do jobs to meet the needs that they bring with them, right? So cities have a way of assuring their own survival on that basis. And cities will grow. The needs of people living in cities will also grow. And so now a whole sort of mercantile class of tradespeople will emerge like they haven't before, essentially. And so that sort of is the first big shift away from a purely farming-based society. And you've got this guy to thank. So loss of population drives up wages. And that drive up of wages, by the way, will not just apply in the cities. It'll apply in the terms of what you'll be able to wrest out of your peasantry in terms of whatever food or protection payment they're able to, you're able to wrest out of them. So it will become less economically lucrative for the lords in the feudal system to run farms, and they will abandon those farms and move to the cities, and they'll pursue manufacturing instead. Why won't they ply a trade? Well, they'll have some money, and based on the old adage that you got to spend money to make money, they'll have that money to spend, and they'll be able to buy it in certain cases. Manufacturing will increase trade and create the need for more resources. And just like in the case of wars of expansion, the need to pay soldiers, this will drive colonialism, which in turn will provide the resources and continue to drive the system toward the Industrial Revolution. So just a general point about the Industrial Revolution is that, and it's roughly sort of dated to 1780, I think it is, when James Watt invents the steam engine. And what's the significance of the Industrial Revolution? Why do we care? What's the big deal? From an economic standpoint. Not from a standpoint of we wouldn't all have computers and iPhones if it weren't for the Industrial Revolution. That's true. But from an economic standpoint, what does industrialization do for an economy? Based on the idea that an economy is, particularly a market economy, is based on the trading of goods and services.
It creates new jobs.
Does it though? So it does and it doesn't, right? So yes, it will create a sort of a certain class. Hi. It will create a class of jobs that didn't exist before, right? Because it'll give rise to things like factories, and those factories will need to be worked by people. But it will also cut jobs. Where's it going to cut jobs?
And like the machine operators.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's not like Skynet with the Terminator, but I mean, it is, one thing, it's going to require far fewer people to farm. It's going to make farming far less labor intensive. So the big drop that happens between 90% of your population being in farming and maybe 15% being in farming happens because of this. And in the very same way that now a demand for labor drives wages way down, right? That'll be an incentive for people to go to cities, and urbanization will increase that much more. And emigration and things like that, you know, because there's a need to survive, and in order to survive, you have to have resources. That's going to drive people to into economic relationships that they did not have before. So. And from the standpoint of production, obviously, it means you're going to be able to turn out more goods and services much more quickly, which from the standpoint of supply and demand sort of intuitively tells you profits go up, but it also tells you that you don't want to overproduce or else prices go down, right? So there's going to be some comfort zone in that. And finally, it also means things get more dangerous. Work becomes a more dangerous endeavor. You know, in farming, particularly in animal husbandry, you're working with animals. That is always a dangerous endeavor when they weigh, you know, 5 times what you do. It's why domestication is so incredibly important. Because if you didn't domesticate, you know, a cow, it would just kill you and leave, right? So it has to be, you know, particularly amenable to living with you, all of that kind of thing, right? But it will become much more dangerous with industrialization. Farming is much more dangerous than it used to be. And then that doesn't even count the dangers that are inherent in working in a factory, right? Particularly before they have worked out all of the kinks. And that's not like, you know, 25 years into the first factory. That's like, you know, 1923, and like, you know, a couple of dozen Jewish women get killed in a burning building in New York City because they didn't figure out that they needed better fire exits, that kind of thing. So